Hi everyone, my name is Alisha Ukani. I'm a fifth-year PhD student, and as Stefan mentioned, we'll be talking about practical support for integrity validation of criminal legal process. And since this is a shorter talk, I'll ask you to leave questions until the end. And this is joint work with a lot of great people in the room, including Catherine, Erlins, my advisor Alex, Stefan, as well as our collaborator Ross at UC Merced. So I want to start with a sad and true story, how in late 2023, Verizon gave information to somebody in response to a search warrant that was submitted. They received a search warrant saying this woman was a prime suspect in a criminal investigation. They needed her physical address and her phone number immediately. And the search warrant was not from the police. It was from this woman's stalker. And so the stalker actually showed up outside this woman's house because he got this information before he was actually arrested. This is not the only time that this sort of court order has been abused. In 2016, a Brooklyn prosecutor admitted to forging a judge's signature on wiretap orders so that she could spy on her romantic interest as well as another woman. And we know that hackers are actually taking this power to create these fake court orders and selling them on the dark web for about $200 per order. This problem has gotten so bad that late last year, the FBI actually put out an alert warning US companies to be careful of receiving these fake orders. So in this talk, we're really focusing on something called criminal legal process. These are basically legal documents that demand some sort of information for some specific government authorities. So for example, search warrants, subpoenas, and I'll use warrant as a stand-in for this term. Now, these are really powerful tools. They can reveal a lot of sensitive information. Here I have a screenshot of an actual real search warrant, and you can look at the information that the government is requesting from the company. They're asking for all email, files, cloud storage, location information, photos, calendar entries. This is really sensitive and revealing information. And imagine if this information got into the wrong hands, especially somebody who might be stalking or harassing you. Fortunately, it's really easy to create these sort of modified or fake search warrants. So here I have an example. One is real, one is fake. Can anybody spot the difference in the fake one? Just shout it out if you see it. Yeah, so I'll zoom in and show you. So on the left was the original and on the right was the modified version, and the only change was that I replaced the email identifier. So if we go back to this is what it looked like, you know, maybe now that you know the string fake warrants is in here, that's kind of a tip off. But if you were a company who just received this warrant on the right, it looks really realistic. You might not realize that this was fake. So not only is it really easy to create these sort of forgeries, it's really easy to submit them too. So some companies, like Verizon, will just let you email them directly. A lot of other companies actually have these portals where law enforcement officers will create accounts on the portal and then they can submit these requests through them. So now these companies do a lot of due diligence in creating new accounts. But what if you could just hack somebody's existing account? Really, the security of this portal relies on the security of every law enforcement officer in the US. And prior UCSD research has actually found that law enforcement domains are easily hijackable, though I'll note they didn't actually hijack these domains. So what do we actually need in this space? We have some clear security requirements that we need some sort of authorization. We want to make sure that this document is actually signed by a judge or has the proper legal authority. We also want to make sure that we have integrity. We want to know that the document hasn't been modified after it's been signed by this judge. So we can think about some possible solutions. And we might ask, hey, can we just call up the judge and say, did you actually sign this warrant? Well, unfortunately, we can't do that. These courts are usually not allowed to discuss their outstanding warrants. And that's because we don't want actual criminals to call up judges and say, hey, is there a search warrant for me? And then, delete all their data. So we can't do this. But, we have a lot of great digital tools. We have a lot of cryptography. We can say, can we create digital signatures for these documents? And so I'll walk through this in a little bit more detail. In this sort of ideal solution, we have this process where a law enforcement officer is going to send over their warrant to the judge, maybe give their oath over a phone call, and the judge, if they think that this is valid, is going to sign off on it. Now, when they sign the warrant, they would also create a digital signature for it. I won't go into the details too much, but you can think of the digital signature as like a hash or a summary of the document. Now, digital signatures kind of give us two properties. One is that we can check that whatever you're hashing is the same, so it hasn't been modified. And also we can check that the signature was created with the right key of the signing party. So we can check that it was actually created by the judge. So this seems to give us exactly what we want. We can continue. The judge is going to send the signed warrant and that digital signature to the prosecutor, the law enforcement officer, who then sends it to the tech company. Finally, the tech company is going to check that signature. They'll verify that it actually comes from a judge and that the document they receive is that one with the signature. Now, I think this is a great idea. And it's so great that actually a lot of senators came together and put forward a bill that did not pass to say that we want judges to use these digital signatures and to sign all of these documents. Now, I think there's one thing we're overlooking, unfortunately, that maybe is why this didn't actually go through. So even though this is a great idea and gives us the security guarantees that we want, it doesn't reflect the actual norms and practices of the US legal system. In particular, courts often deal with pen and paper, and they really want to continue using pen and paper. They don't want to switch over to PDFs. And how do you make a digital signature physical? So going back to our requirements, it's not just that we need these security guarantees, we also have more functionality goals. So we want the system to be paper compatible, so the warrant can be digital or physical, we'll still get these guarantees. And we want to make sure that it's easy to use and deploy. We want to minimize the burden on the courts because they're already overworked and understaffed. So let's go back to our solutions. We can't do these digital signatures or not as the way they're presented, but maybe we can create some sort of centralized database. And so maybe we can upload the warrants and the signatures to that database. Unfortunately, there's yet another problem here. And it's that, there actually is kind of a centralized database for court orders. In the courts, it's called CMECF. There's a public version called PACER. So even this so-called centralized database isn't actually used by all courts because the courts themselves are very decentralized. There are federal courts, state courts, tribal courts, and even within these categories, they all use very different processes. And so the centralized efforts are not actually really centralized. I'll also note that PACER was hacked, and because of that attack, the courts were told not to upload any sensitive documents into PACER anymore. And so we don't want to add yet another piece of infrastructure that's going to be difficult to maintain and could be attacked by, in this case, nation-state attackers. So let's go back to our requirements. Now we have even more to consider. Like I said, the courts are decentralized, and so we don't want to create some sort of centralized repository that they have to deal with. And also, we want to make sure that our solution can be incrementally deployed. We don't want to have to require every single court to join the system before any of them can start receiving these security guarantees. So I've talked a lot about what doesn't work. Let's talk about what actually might work and our proposed solution. So I want to go back to the idea of digital signatures. They didn't work as I presented them, but what if we could make them physical? So they give us the security guarantees we want, we just need to adapt them a little bit. First, we need to start with taking a physical document and getting that into some sort of digital state. So once a physical warrant or a digital warrant is signed, we need to extract the contents to be able to create that digital signature. So there's many different ways to extract the content of a document. In our case, we're using OCR, which just takes an image of text and gives you the actual text. But there's lots of other options, including ML models, perceptual hashing, things like that. Now we need to go from the digital to the physical. And so the way we do that is we're encoding digital signatures in QR codes. Now, we often think of QR codes as something you scan with your camera and then you get to a website. So these QR codes are embedding URLs, but they don't have to. They can embed any data you want. And so we actually collect all of that digital signature information, embed them in QR codes, and then we collect all the QR codes and append them to the document. So this is what it looks like all together. So we have our law enforcement officer who creates this warrant, sends it to the judge who signs off on this. None of this has changed. But then the judge is going to send this document to their court clerk, who is going to run software that we provide that'll basically do that process of capturing the contents of the document using OCR and generating these QR codes. Now, if it's a physical document, the court clerk would first have to scan the document, then run our software, and then if they want to keep the document physical, they'd have to print out these pages of QR codes. Finally, the warrant and those QR codes would eventually make their way to the company who receives them. And so, again, we would provide software so the company could check the document that they receive and check it against the content of those QR codes. And so ultimately, what we would do is forgery detection at that point. So we'll detect any modifications to the page, and we'll annotate those regions of the document by essentially drawing a box around where we think something has changed. I'll also note that these tech companies already have legal analysts who inspect every piece of criminal legal process that they receive. They check that it's not overly broad, but also that it isn't suspicious. And so really we're building a tool to help these analysts, not replace them. And so if we do find that something has changed in the document, we leave it to them to decide whether this is something that changes the legal meaning of the document and that they need a new version, or that it's okay. So going back to this example that I showed you earlier, how would we actually detect that something's changed in the second document? Well, we would draw a box around where the email identifier has changed. And so this is what the analyst would see. And in this case, they could say this clearly changes the meaning of the document and that they shouldn't go forward with it. So in summary, hackers are unfortunately already exploiting these types of court orders to steal sensitive user data. And by actually talking to judges, court clerks, law enforcement, and these tech company providers, we developed a set of requirements that reflect the actual practices and norms of the legal system. And we propose a system that respects these requirements and will help detect these warrants that are forged or modified. So with that, thank you so much, and I'm happy to take questions.
You know, as I think about the problem you're working on here, it actually reminds me a little bit of the content ID problem that YouTube has to address for copyrighted content. They need to recognize whether a video or a segment of the video or audio from the video is a part of something that's been copyrighted from a major studio. And I'm just wondering if that is a relevant comparison here, and you think that this, what are the important differences for this model? As far as I know, YouTube hasn't published anything on copyright.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting comparison. I think this situation is slightly different because we know, at least in the case of a potentially modified warrant, that there was some sort of ground truth, like correct version that we want to check against. But there could be also cases where it's just completely fake, completely made up, and it wouldn't have that sort of like the actual copyrighted version to compare to. So it's similar to that, but maybe like also has this other component.
And just to add, also if a tiny change, like in the example that Alisha gave, has huge impact, right? You change 5 characters and all of a sudden you're getting someone else's mail. YouTube doesn't have to worry about a tiny change in Tinkerbell's wings. Like they don't care. It's like, does it look like Tinkerbell? Yeah, it's a problem.
Yeah.
I could imagine that with OCR, the quality of the scanned document has a lot to do with it. I would also imagine that a lot of courts probably have like 30-year-old scanners that barely work. How robust is this process to just really degrade scans? And is this where some of the other kind of techniques of the ML or perceptual hashing stuff comes in?
Yeah, that is a great question. It's something we're actively looking into. So we actually went through a lot of, existing court documents on Pacer and looked at what were their scan resolutions. I think most often it was in the 200, 300, 400 range, though I think there was one case of like 150 DPI. And so we're actually taking a bunch of warrants, printing them out, scanning them at various resolutions, and trying to see, are we having any false positives in what we're flagging? And so we do find that having a poor quality scan does impact the results a bit. But we're also using a lot of computer vision techniques to be able to try and process the document and make it a little bit cleaner. Yeah.
Did you talk to lawyers or judges and see what they thought of the system?
Yeah, we did talk to them. We've talked to a few, like one retired judge. We've talked to, he was also a prosecutor. So we did get a lot of feedback on this idea. And so I think The best solution in terms of workload is to, not change anything, but of course we need to do something. And so this is basically what we've designed to be satisfying the usability requirements.
And a reminder for a federal process, they already have to scan it in because it has to go into Pacer.
Yeah.
So it's a software change.
Yeah. And we're kind of hoping that eventually, if this is deployed, we could integrate it into like PDF editing tools. So it's really just like you click a button, these QR codes magically appear, and then you're done. So we would definitely want to make it as easy as possible. Yeah.
Let's do one last question.
I'm just curious about, how far you've gone down the path of actually finding like a real pilot user, or like figuring out like, would anybody actually adopt this in practice?
Yeah, great question. We've definitely found companies who are very willing to work with us because this is a big problem for them. You don't want to end up in the news like Verizon. But I think it's definitely, we don't have a lot of contacts with judges, and so we're still working on being able to find them and ask them if they'd be willing to try this out. So that's what we're still working on.
All right, thank you very much.